Shadow numbers in the stand of dreams. You couldn't believe what I've become. Revolution always from my head on a silver, just a bucket on a
And last but not least, we have Megan Montemurro, who is the beat writer for the Chicago Tribune on the Chicago Cubs. Give it up for Megan. So the format for today, we're going to start off. I'm going to kind of get them into some questions, and then eventually I'll break off and start answering your questions that you may have. So keep them stored up in the back of your mind. Help me out. Give me some of your questions coming soon. So first question that I have, I really wanted to take this down to the start, kind of going back to when you first thought that, okay, sports journalism, I think that's something I really want to do. Can you remember a specific moment or a collection of moments that you kind of first got the idea of that as a profession?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I always kind of knew I wanted to go into journalism. Kind of runs in my family. My grandpa was a journalist. His brothers were journalists. So I grew up hearing stories about that world. And, you know, I loved sports, played sports through high school, was always good at writing. And I kind of knew, you know, second half of kind of high school, junior, senior year, that I really wanted to go the sports journalism route. Ultimately went to the University of Illinois in Champaign and, you know, was in the journalism program there and worked at the student newspaper there for about 3 of the 4 years. And that whole experience really kind of solidified for me knowing what I wanted to do and specifically kind of wanted to be a beat writer for a sport and eventually, you know, made my way into baseball.
Yeah, it's similar for me. I went to Glenbrook South High School, so not too far away from here. And at 14 years old, I got into radio. And I had an opportunity to call games, play-by-play, color analyst, sideline reporting from a very young age. And I knew that I wasn't cut out to play soccer because I had a bunch of concussions and I just wasn't very athletic. But this was my sport. It was how I got a chance to stay connected to the sports that I loved but never was going to be able to play. And I went into college knowing that this is exactly what I wanted to do. I went to Indiana University, class of 2012, and I went in as a broadcast major. So I did student television, had several internships with 247 Sports, with the Fox station in Indianapolis, and I got to cover everything from, again, a very young age. As a freshman, I was covering men's basketball, women's basketball, football, a lot of the, you know, premier sports for a Big Ten institution. And it's interesting to me now, like kind of what I do is so multifaceted because I went in with a radio background, a broadcast background, but now a lot of what I do is writing.
Same. I wanted to be on the radio ever since I was a kid. I was obsessed with sports as a kid. I'm the oldest of 3 boys, and we're a big sports family, but I was a very average athlete, and as my career sort of came crashing and burning down towards the end of high school, I realized, okay, I'm not going to play a professional sport, obviously, not that I was ever too delusional. So I figured the first sports radio station in town had just sort of come on the air when I was halfway through high school back in 1992. I'm a little bit older. And when the Score came on and we realized that there was a format to actually do sports talk radio, I thought, well, maybe I'll give that a go because I always wanted to be on the radio. So I kind of knew pretty early on that it was what I wanted to do and just found a way to make it work.
Already great content here. Megan, I'm going to go back to you. When you talk about your family members that were sports journalists, what did they specifically cover, and how did that kind of influence you going forward?
So my great uncle was a big horse racing handicapper and wrote about it, and that's not really my thing. But and then my grandpa and his brother were on the news side, and you know, I got a lot of insight into kind of, you know, the news equivalent of beat work, where you're showing up, you're talking to people, one story that always stood on my mind was, at that point it was, the 50s, 60s, and, my grandpa had to call in a story and to try and beat his competitors. His sister-in-law, who worked for the Bell Telephone Company, gave him out-of-order stickers, and he stuck one on the nearest payphone to the building he had to come out of to call in the story. So he stuck one on there before, came out, called it in, and it was stuff like that where, the creativity, the deadlines, just kind of all of it, and getting a glimpse of just what goes into being a journalist in general, always really stood out to me and always sounded exciting, and being able to meld, my interests and love of sports and that element was always super appealing to me.
Courtney, you were talking about how you started off 14 years old, kind of doing more of a broadcasting role. How did you go from kind of focusing on broadcasting and then going into writing?
It's funny because my first, real job as a journalist was at the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, Mississippi. It's the state paper of record. And I was hired there in 2013 to build their video platform because of my background with video and video production and on camera, behind the scenes work. And I didn't really fall into writing until I was around writers every single day. And I thought, okay, this is something very clearly I need to learn how to do, I want to do, because I did some of it in high school, some of it in college, but my primary focus was broadcast. So I started out writing, covering recruiting, because it was there was such a wealth of opportunity down in Jackson, Mississippi, where, when you think about the hotbed for football recruits in the United States, it's right there in the southeastern part of the United States, and same with basketball too. So I had an opportunity being around so many writers where I learned how to self-edit. I learned how to format stories in a way where it was clear and concise and told a story. And that was completely different from any broadcast writing I had done in terms of, formulating my scripts for TV, formulating my scripts for feature stories and radio hits and all things of that nature. So I always find that funny. It's like I wasn't a real writer until I was technically a professional journalist, which I use very lightly because your first couple jobs out of college, especially if you get into the newspaper, the journalism world, you don't necessarily feel like a professional because you're still very much learning in those early stages like I was.
I'm going to start with Carmen on this one. We can work down this way, but I know you all have kind of your expertise, NFL Bears, Chicago Cubs. Carmen, you have a little bit more freedom. You kind of have to talk about everything on the radio, but even then you still have a focus or a lot of sports that you predominantly talk about. How did you kind of find your way into certain niches, like which sport am I going to focus on? What's my thing?
Well, I think you learn pretty early in our business, especially doing radio and television, that football is kind of king when it comes to sports in this country. I think we all understand that and know that. And I learned very early on that was going to be sort of the driving focus of our talk shows. It's the most important time of year for us. From the fall into the winter all the way through this weekend. Football season, as Courtney will tell you, really doesn't ever end anymore. She's got to work her butt off all season. For me, it's really just during the season for the most part. But I learned a long time ago that the NFL was going to be sort of the driving force of kind of what we do. And, I didn't play for as much as I did as a young kid in all the sports that I did play. I never played football. I never played an organized snap of football. I played hockey and baseball growing up, even played rec league basketball, AYSO soccer. So I had been coached in a lot of different sports growing up, never played a single organized snap of football. And I realized early on that, I could talk about the league. I was such a sports nut growing up. Like, I could talk about players in the league and the history a little bit. But I started to realize that I didn't know the things that I really had to know about the game of football because, again, it was never coached to me. I didn't understand some of the vernacular that coaches and players would use. And so I realized that I was going to have to start doing work. And, I was in my 20s at this point, my early to mid-20s. And I realized that I was going to have to start doing work on understanding the game a lot more. And so I studied that, and I feel like I've got a better grasp on it now than I ever did. And I put a lot of time and effort on trying to educate myself on the nuance of the game, because it really is important. I mean, like I said, from about August through the end of the year for sports radio, for television, for things you see on ESPN most of the time, football is kind of the engine. And so that's the one thing that we've probably, and I think certainly I've honed in on more than anything. I love football. I wouldn't say football is my favorite sport, but it's the one that I know we're going to talk about the most, and I think it's the one that we put the most time and effort in, really.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of multifaceted because my day job, like my big main job, is covering the Chicago Bears for ESPN. But I also host radio nationally 4 or 5 days a week right now on ESPN Radio. So if there's no local programming that's getting picked up, which most times in Chicago doesn't start until 8 p.m. at night, like that's where I'm on air. And we talk about everything. And that's the hard part, where you have to balance being the expert on your beat and being up at Hallis Hall 4 or 5 days a week and covering Bears games and knowing the intricacies of what's going on with that franchise, and also keeping tabs on what's going on throughout the rest of the NFL. And, for example, I was on air 2 to 6 yesterday, and we talked Kyrie Irving. We talked LeBron James closing in on the scoring title. We talked about what's going to happen potentially ahead of the NBA trade deadline with Kevin Durant. We talked about the Super Bowl. Like, there's so many different topics, but to Carmen's point, the NFL, no matter what time of year it is, reigns king in the sports world in terms of conversation, because there's always something. So just because the Super Bowl happens this weekend and then the season's over until next September, there's free agency, there's the quarterback carousel, there's the draft, and of course, here locally, we all want to know what the Bears are going to do with that number 1 overall pick. So it never stops. And I just think about working at a place like ESPN. We don't have the rights to the same broadcast rights to the NFL as a CBS or Westwood One or on radio, or Fox, NBC, any of those things. Yet, if you go to the ESPN.com right now, the first tab is NFL, and the NFL news is what carries our content. It carries the conversation on TV, on radio, on any of our linear and non-linear platforms, because it's still like America's pastime, so to speak, where we are always interested in. And I think as someone who covers the league, both on the micro with one team and the macro, the entire league, it never stops. That there's always something to talk about when it comes to the NFL.
Yeah, I'd say for me, I mean, I've always loved baseball. I played softball growing up. I can remember coming home from school as a kid and watching the end of, the day game, Cubs games on WGN. And that's always been a big part of, what fueled my love of sports. And then, getting into college and getting close to graduation, I didn't really necessarily have the goal of, I want to become a beat writer for a major league team. It kind of just happened to work out that way. I never had any internships in college, but I did pitch a lot of freelance stories to an editor in the Northwest suburbs for, about local athletes that were at Illinois. And that led to an opportunity to help cover the Stanley Cup playoffs in 2010 for the paper, and that eventually resulted in a few months after I graduated, the editor calling me and say, "Hey, we need somebody to cover the Cubs and Sox. Would you be willing to move to Chicago and do that?" Of course, I immediately said yes, and so that experience of learning what the daily grind is, when you're covering 162 games. Especially in a 2-team city. At that time, I was covering Sox and Cubs. So basically, I was at the ballpark every day, either at Wrigley or, on the south side. And I just loved it. I loved, showing up. If it's a 7 p.m. game, you're getting there at 2:30, and you're probably not leaving until potentially 11:30 or midnight. And so just kind of over the last 12, 13 years of being on a big league beat, I really love it. I going on Monday to spring training for 5.5, 6 weeks. And so it's definitely different in the sense of, if I'm on a 10-game road trip, I could be in 3 different cities over that time covering 9 games, and you might only have 1 off day. So it's a little different from some of the other leagues, especially, football, NHL, NBA, there's those more one-off games. But I really love it. And, having the opportunity to cover the Cubs for the Tribune, is a dream. People read about the Cubs, whether they're good or bad. And so knowing that you have an engaged audience, no matter kind of what's happening on the field, is a lot of fun.
I want to take you back maybe to a moment in time. This could have been college, or maybe it was earlier when you were covering, a sport in high school, or maybe even later than that. Do you recall a moment where maybe there was one story or there was one segment where you said to yourself, wait a second, all right, I'm really good. Like I'm better than most at this, and I think I've got something here, and it maybe kind of gave you the confidence to really push forward in a different way. Megan, starting with you.
That's a good question. One that comes to mind, which would have been later. So I covered the Phillies for 6 or 7 years. And, it's a big market. I was covering the team when they signed Bryce Harper. And so, everybody's kind of writing the same stuff. And so, I remember thinking like, okay, what's something different I can do that, I can take advantage of the relationships I've built with people in the organization. So I went from kind of a off the field perspective of like, okay, how did all of the different departments within the organization, marketing, business side, tickets and sales, like how did they prepare, for the second that Harper signed to launch all these different things that they did on social media and ticket sales and jerseys and all that. And so, it took, people in those different departments who generally you're not interacting with on a day-to-day basis on a beat, but that over the years to give you insight and share information. And like one thing that is very hard usually in my experience to get organizations to talk about is how many people are in their season ticket base. And I remember sitting down with their, head guy on the sales marketing side, breaking down like, okay, this is what our peak number was when we were really good in 08 and 09, and this is what our season ticket base was last year, and this is how many tickets we've sold in the 2 weeks since Harper signed. And so a lot of that stuff comes from relationships. And I think the thing that stood out to me too is like I said, there's so many people covering a big story like that. To be able to find something unique that taps into new information for me was really rewarding and something that, reminded me like, okay, this is something that you can do frequently. You just have to kind of make the time to do it amid the day-to-day stuff.
Back in the fall of 2013, I was in the thick of football season down south, which of course is nonstop, a 7-day grind, even though for high school football, those games are on Friday, but I was also covering Ole Miss and Mississippi State, wherever they were on the Saturday. And I was so entrenched in it. And my sports editor at the time at the paper had the audacity to come to me to throw this other big project on my plate and said, hey, because I was still learning the landscape down in Mississippi. I had been there for like 6 months, and we just so happened to have the #1 basketball recruit in the country in the class of 2015, like right here in Jackson, Mississippi. And since I was doing heavy video work at that time, we came up with the idea to pitch this docuseries on what is it like for the life of a 2015 #1 recruit in this class. Like he was 16 years old at the time. And it was kind of a leap of faith. And I was like, all right, I'll do this. So I was trying to balance so much at the time, but and you guys will hear the term MMJ throughout, the broadcast world. It's multimedia journalists. It used to be called one-man banding, but MMJ is more of the politically correct way to say you're doing literally everything. So in front of the camera, behind the camera, writing, producing, editing, everything, and shooting stuff too. So we turned this project that I, did by and large on my own into this award-winning 3-year docuseries called Beyond the Game, and it highlighted this player, Malik Newman, who ended up at Mississippi State, and he went to Kansas and then tested his luck in the NBA. But the journey of his recruiting, and granted, the game was so different back then with how recruiting was covered and how, the rules, obviously NIL and all that stuff changed how recruiting and the landscape of what it looks like now. But to build that relationship, to Megan's point, building those relationships, those sources, and getting people to talk about stuff that typically isn't talked about, that's what comes with being a journalist. That's one of the hardest things you can do, to build sources, to build people's trust in you so they're willing to talk to you and they're willing to tell their story so you can create something out of it. And I remember when I was kind of in the thick of it that season and turning out content that really certainly nobody in the state of Mississippi had done. And frankly, at that point, it was ahead of its time before athletes, young athletes, recruits were taking control and creating their own media arms, which you see a lot of them do now with mixtapes and stuff like that. But we were telling like a real story, a day-to-day grind of this is what it's like for a 16-year-old who's balancing school, basketball, and also the number one recruit in the country, where John Calipari, Jim Boeheim, Coach K are coming through his high school trying to get him to commit. So that project launched a lot of my career because I've never applied for a job outside of a job that I wound up in Mississippi by a circuitous route. That's kind of like sometimes when you create things and you do stuff that's forward thinking that no one else is doing, people take notice of that. So for me, I look at my career and where I am right now, realizing that launched it to where people saw that and said, hey, can you come build this for us? Can you come do this for us? We want to ask you about this opportunity. And I'm thankful I said yes and didn't shoot down my sports editor's crazy idea at that time, just given the undertaking of it.
Yeah, I'd sort of reiterate what both Courtney and Megan said. Like, I had a professor or a teacher in college who used to say, and I went to this small liberal arts school in Chicago because I kind of knew what I wanted to do, and all the teachers were mostly working professionals. And he was a very veteran, grizzled, jaded TV and radio producer. But he used to always reiterate to us to never turn down an opportunity, even if it's something that you were uncomfortable with or something you didn't really want to do. I started my career in this business as a producer. I knew I did not want to be a producer, but I remember very early on, actually, of being on the air. When I first started on the radio, I used to do SportsCenter updates. We used to do them on the radio back then. I mean, this is long before, our phones had scores and everything, and there was still a need for updates every 20 minutes. This was across ESPN's entire national platform. All the radio stations, especially if we were one of the first owned and operated stations, for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, top 20 and 40, we had SportsCenter updates. And I did that, but I wanted to do a lot more, and I used to knock on our program director's door and ask to do more and to do more and to do more. And then I remember him calling me into his office, and he said, okay, you're going to do more, and here's your first reporting job. You're covering the Chicago Marathon in 2 weeks. And I was like, what? How do you cover a marathon? Like, what? I was dumbfounded. And I said, well, and I'm thinking in the back of my head, don't say no, because I've been asking. But I remember sort of saying, I don't know anything about that. And he threw the media guide down on his desk, and he said, well, you've got 2 weeks to learn. And so I took the media guide home and I read through it, 3 or 4 times, and I started highlighting things. And there I was a couple of Sundays later on the lead vehicle with Carrie Pinkowski, who's the race director who ran track at Villanova. And I'm on this vehicle following these runners, and we're doing this live broadcast. We carried the marathon. And I remember getting to the end of it and thinking, like, wow, I actually did it. I sounded like I knew what I was doing. I sounded like I knew what I was talking about. I studied really hard, and I had interesting notes about all these different men and women who were leading their respective categories in this race. And I don't know, it was kind of a moment for me where I was like, yeah, all right, I better never say no to anything. And even if it's something I think I don't know a lot about, I can kind of find my way through it. Not fake, but like legitimately find your way through it just by working at it. And I realized that, I don't know, I guess it's, yeah, I figured to myself in that moment, like, this is kind of doable. I think I'll make it work.
I was going to go somewhere kind of looking back in college, but Courtney's taking me in a different direction here. You said something specifically I want to talk about. that word sources. You talked about how important it is to kind of develop those sources. Couple scenarios here. Maybe you can kind of talk about how you go about developing those sources, knowing who to trust, knowing who not to trust. And the second part, has there been an instance where you believed a source's information, put it out there, and it ended up not being true? So Courtney, you gave me the inspiration, so I'll start with you and then.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, source building in journalism is one of the hardest things you can do. And, I've been doing this for about 10 years, and I'm still trying new techniques, trying to figure out who I need and who to trust. Because there's a big difference between people who, you think will help you, but also those who you can trust and those who are reliable. So the way I go about source building, and I think you'll get different perspectives depending on who you talk to, and certainly as a woman in this industry, I'm sure Megan can talk to this too, it can be difficult because a lot of times, most of the sources, most of the people we cover are male athletes, male coaches, and there is always the fine line of how do you build sources where people think that you're coming from a genuine, honest, and earnest place. And if you're doing your job the right way, if you have the right intentions and you're trying not just to fish for information, but to build a relationship, that's what this whole thing comes down to. Because most times in reporting, there's about 90% you can't use and 10% you can use. And to be able to build those relationships where you're not just hitting somebody up when you need information, some of the most successful people I know in journalism are those who can maintain those relationships when they don't need something. Because when they do need something, typically people who have the information, that might be gatekeeping the information, are the ones that you need. And so that's kind of the general overview on source building. And I can say confidently, yeah, I have trusted. I have an example of it last year when I was covering the Minnesota Vikings, which I did before I started covering the Bears. There was an offensive line coach for the Vikings who was telling everybody in the organization that because the Vikings had cleaned house. This was February of last year, right around now last year. And this coach was telling everybody, I'm going to Buffalo. I'm going to Buffalo. I've got the gig. And I corroborated this with 3 different team sources from the Minnesota Vikings. Not league sources, which could be anybody from an agent to somebody who hears it around the league. 3 people inside the organization who were in the know. One of them had a press release ready to go. And it turns out he ended up not getting the Buffalo job and getting a job with another team instead. And it hurts when you're wrong on that. And granted, it is a benign thing, but it's not you said the quarterback's getting traded and he's not. But as a journalist, any sort of knock like that, and especially it's not like this is my first job, or that was my first job, I'd been doing this for a long time. So sometimes things are, sourcing is not always 100%. There is a margin for error that you have to account for, even when you have it confirmed from 3 different team sources. Information changes. I think that that's something that we realize in today's day and age of social media, where things happen up to the minute. There's a 24-hour news cycle. And beyond that, people can change their minds. You're not locked into what you say you're going to do, or a team might rescind an offer. And I don't know if I'll ever truly get to the bottom of what had happened, but it's another example that you can just never be too careful, even when you feel like you've done your due diligence. Sometimes things happen that are completely out of your control, but bringing it back to how do you do this? How do you make sure that you have well-sourced information? You've got to be able to corroborate your information with somebody else. So of course at ESPN, our policy, most times they want minimum of 2 sources. When you're willing to give somebody anonymity to talk on a subject, and I might be writing something and I'm saying, according to sources X, Y, and Z, sources plural, that's important because you need to have somebody, especially given the magnitude of for example, if I hear from a player's agent that he signed with this team, with the Bears for X years, X $1 million guaranteed, if I get that from the agent himself, agents are always going to kind of bloviate on the numbers because they want to make it look good. But one source on that from the agent themselves is typically enough. But if there's information on and this is just like a hypothetical, like, hey, there was a rift in the locker room. I cannot have that from one person. I've got to have that from multiple sources that were in the locker room or, knew about it and can confirm it, because the more sourced you are, the more reliable the information you're putting out there is, because we have a responsibility as journalists to get it right. And you're not going to bat 1,000 100% of the time, but you try your hardest, because it eats you alive when you don't get stuff right.
Yeah, I would say, for baseball, so like, starting Monday until end of October, potentially in November, like you're seeing these players and coaches on a daily basis. You're seeing them more than you see anyone else basically in your life for that stretch. So there's ample opportunities to build sources. I think for me, the mentality I developed over the years was every day I step into the clubhouse, I'm going to talk to somebody like just as a person, like kind of what Courtney was getting at. Like I'm not going to be asking them, I'm trying to interview them. Doesn't even necessarily have to be about baseball. Could be asking a guy how the renovation on his off-season home is going. But like just building those connections so they don't feel every time they see you walking towards them, you're going to be asking them for something. And I found like that has been really helpful in building relationships within a clubhouse, among coaching staff. It's a little more difficult in terms of front office people because they might not be around the field very much. You might not have very many face-to-face interactions. So, those times that you can reach out and just have those casual conversations, even if it's like, oh, I saw so-and-so at AAA had a crazy game, like, did you have a chance to watch it or something? Just little things so it's not feeling like you're pumping them for information every time you have an interaction with them. And I think like one thing that really has stood out to me too is everybody develops sources and relationships differently with different people. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Something that stands out to me for that is, when I covered the Phillies for The Athletic, I had a beat writer partner. So like there were basically two of us at almost every home game. We split up road trips. And a couple of years ago, from us individually talking to different pitchers on the team, we had heard that there were a lot of issues with the pitching coach and the manager and how they were implementing things in communication. So we tag teamed together and we each talked to people that we had the better relationships with. And, at the end, he went and talked to the pitching coach one-on-one. I sat down with the manager and both of us said, hey, we're writing this story. Do you have any comments on some of these things that guys were saying? And, there were certain things that even we had heard that we couldn't write because if we had written it, they would know who was our source on it. So kind of what Courtney said, you can't always write what you hear. But I think it really highlighted how, again, your relationships develop differently. You can't assume, you're going to be able to have the same connection with one guy or one coach or one front office person that your competitor might have, but that doesn't mean like you're at a disadvantage. Everybody has their different relationships and that doesn't mean it hinders your job in any way. You have to approach it the way that you feel works best.
They nailed that. Like succinctly, perfectly, and it's about relationships and don't always be aggressive. Sort of when you're cultivating these relationships, there's something to not always having your microphone or your pen and your paper in their face, because that's going to probably get you nowhere. That is no different than when your relatives did it 50 years ago, the way I learned it 25, 30 years ago, the way they're doing it now. Like that'll never change. At least I don't anticipate it. Relationship building is probably not going to change all that much. And that is really, really key. And it was something that, if we were covering a baseball game, best place to be was behind the cage talking to the hitting coach or the assistant hitting coach or a player that is a utility guy that's not always a starter. You've got to find sometimes those sorts of people to build relationships with and gain a little trust. And that's the best advice I would give. But it really is all about just building your relationships and understanding that you can't always, don't make them feel like you're always pumping them for information, because that's probably going to get you nowhere.
Is your sources and people you have relationships with will lie to your face, even though you know the information you have is 100% correct. That's something I've learned over the years, and that puts you on a do not trust list in the future. But there are certain people in certain organizations that are super protective of information or are paranoid that they will get in trouble, even though it's information you already know, that they won't even confirm anything for you. So I think it's always good to keep some skepticism in the back of your mind, especially when you're in the early stages of developing relationships.
One more thing to add to that. So during COVID, the 2020 season and even last season, I know in the NFL, we were Zoom interviews only. And that changed the way that we covered teams because everyone's getting the same access. You have limited access to players and coaches. So one thing that I take into account is never take any day that you have locker room availability or any availability for granted. And of course, we get into the grind of the season. A Friday up at Hallis Hall might feel like a throwaway day if you already have your stories written for the week, if you don't technically need anything for anything you're currently writing. But those can be some of the best days, just like, Megan and Carmen were talking about, to go up and talk to guys, go up and talk to people, talk to the equipment people, like the people who know what's going on in an organization. Sometimes your best sources are people that are not playing the game or coaching the game. It's everybody in the ancillary part of an organization. And it is difficult to get in touch with front office people. That's, general managers, team presidents, anything of that ilk is often more difficult than just being able to go up to somebody and have the freedom to start a conversation. So as a journalist, whenever you have those opportunities, you have to take advantage of them, because we don't ever want to go back to having COVID availability the way that it was across the 4 major sports, and taking any chance you have to talk to people in casual settings just to put a face to the name. So when there is something in the future, you'll be one of the first people. If they want to feed somebody information, you'll be one of the first people they remember, because they knew you from a previous instance where it wasn't you hitting them up for information.
We have a few more minutes left. I'm going to turn to you, the audience, see if we have some questions from you. So who's got something out there? Questions for our sports journalists. Center, what do we got? Right there. Any regrets about maybe a story you didn't take, or any regrets in any other fashion about the industry?
Boy. Regrets about a story that we didn't take.
Or I'll put it this way.
All right.
Regrets you have a story you did do.
I can give you one that's, I don't know if it's a regret, but it's a good story on like sources and things like that, actually. There was a somewhat famous incident about, God, I don't even know how long ago now, maybe 10, 15 years ago, where the Chicago Bears, do you remember that? You guys aren't going to remember this. You remember the Fred Miller, Olin Kreutz?
Yeah,
Okay.
the job punching.
Yeah. So the Bears, most of these teams, the director of security are former police officers, most time former FBI guys. The gentleman who for a long time ran the Bears security was a former FBI SWAT director, and he, as just sort of like a fun thing to do, usually they would do it during the bye week, he would take the guys to the FBI SWAT training facility here in Chicago, and they had a day pretending to be FBI SWAT team members, right? Well, one year, things got a little out of control. There was, you should never be combining a shooting range and drinking, but they were. And 2 Chicago Bears offensive linemen, teammates, got into a scuffle. One broke the other's jaw. And this is something that the Bears obviously wanted to keep very quiet. They were very embarrassed about. They succeeded in keeping it quiet for a little while. The story was relayed to me about 3 days after it happened because I happened to go to high school with the FBI SWAT director's son. So he told me the story. We randomly bumped into each other on like a Thursday night somewhere in the city. We were hanging out, and I hadn't seen him in a little while, and we were catching up. And he told me the story, and I was dumbfounded. And he looked at me at one point, knowing that we're old friends, but he also knew what I did for a living. He goes, "Hey, do me a favor, don't say this on the air." And I said to him, "I won't. Of course, I won't." I couldn't in that moment. The Casey Johnson eventually broke. Casey was on the Bears beat then. Oh, you guys are leaving. He was on the Bears beat, and he ended up breaking the story like 2 months later, and I always kind of regretted it a little bit.
Clap it up. Thank you.